Hey folks, David Stewart here. Don't forget to stop by every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern for New Pub Talk, where I usually have a guest on to talk about something fun. Stop by and chat in the live stream. And don't forget to visit my blog at dvspress.com. Let's talk a little bit about my grading system here. I wanted to take some time and just explain exactly how my grading system for movies, and I also adapt this to games and music, how this works, what the point of it is, why I designed it this way, and what the different scores really mean and what I'm comparing things to when I give out scores. So why did I come up with this? I came up with this around the time that The Last Jedi came out. And The Last Jedi was important for me wanting to develop this. I had it in my mind before this, but it really kind of hammered home the need to have a system like this, because The Last Jedi was a movie that was visually very good. It was interesting throughout, had some really striking visual moments, great use of color. Just in general, it was a really good-looking movie, but it had a really bad story. It had a story that was very poorly executed, and it had a story that is in many ways comes off as spiteful and hurtful to fans. And so a lot of people really correctly felt bad after watching the movie. So do you give The Last Jedi a 2 or a 3 out of 10 because the story was bad, or do you give it an 8 out of 10 because it was so visually interesting, or do you split the difference? So I realized there was a need to come up with the system, because films are doing lots of different things. They're telling a story, and they're also telling that story through a visual medium. So you have to take both of those into account. So if you look into my 3 main categories that I average together, the first big one is production. That includes all the visual design, effects, music, sound design, all that stuff is in that first big category of production. It's a third of the total score. That's important because it's a visual space and an audio space. If you weren't caring about visuals, then you probably shouldn't be making a movie. That's kind of how I feel about it. The next one down is story. Obviously, movies are a story medium. They should be primarily communicating a story unless they're some sort of documentary or nonfiction space that really isn't dealing with story. But even then, they are telling a story, just not a story in the kind of in the narrative format that we're used to for fictional stories. And then the last category is general effect. That's how something affects me. Did it make me feel happy, sad, mad? Did it bore me? Did I find it annoying? Did it make me feel excited? What was the general effect? How did I generally end up being affected by the movie? That's that final score there. And I like this system because I can put in as many subcategories into those as I really want to, depending on what is relevant for a movie. So if I were to judge a silent movie, obviously the fact that it doesn't have sound shouldn't factor into a score for sound design or something like that. So you just leave that off. Likewise, if you're watching a romantic comedy, sound design isn't really a factor. As long as you can hear people talking, that's the sound design. That's really all you need for a story like that. So you can just leave sound design off of the list. But for a movie like Star Wars, under production, you really do need sound design, because sound is a huge part of the effect of the movie and the effect of the story as well. So sound design should be in there. Now, I want to give some examples as to how these different scores work. So when I was developing this, the first thing I thought of is that I should make it really easy to understand as far as scoring goes. Some people still don't get this for some reason, but it's just the same as if you were at school. So 60% is a D, 70% C, 80% B, 90% A. Anything above 9 is going to be A to A plus range. 10 would be perfect score, very difficult to do anything perfectly. This is very natural to me, but it also incorporates the fact that 1 through 5, there's a range of failures. Some things fail a little bit, some things fail a lot. So if we were to look at the category of aesthetics, that's the first one I usually talk about in production. That's primarily the visual design, but it's really everything. Choice of colors, how you construct shots, the costumes, all of that goes into the aesthetic design of the movie. That's why I use that broad term, aesthetics. You can have a really top-notch aesthetic film like Revenge of the Sith that really is a feast for the eyes. Everything that you look at is really new and original and interesting, and bright colors and super specific details all the way through. That really is like 10 out of 10. Great aesthetics. You can have something maybe like Rogue One in the same franchise that's a little bit lower on aesthetics, like maybe 7 or 8 out of 10. They're well executed, but they're not as original, not as interesting. Once you start getting into the 5 and lower range, you're really talking about visual design that is inconsistent, doesn't look very good. Maybe the costumes look really silly, or maybe they're knights and their armor looks really silly, like they're wearing weird spikes or something, or the sets look like they're made out of cardboard. There's a bunch of things that could be in that failure range. But it's not until you get down to the 1 or 2 range that you can really see what a 1 or 2 actually looks like. A 1 is like no aesthetics whatsoever. And that doesn't mean, oh, we shot it at a park outside, because that's an aesthetic choice. I mean, like there's no picture on the screen. Could you come out with a movie like this? You shouldn't, but actually people have. And so there is an example that I could find that's a 1 out of 10 out of aesthetics, maybe a 1.5 because it's a color. It's a movie called Blue. It came out in the early 90s. It was the last film by a director named Derek Jarman, and he died a few months after release. So this was kind of a reflective piece for him. And I don't want to like dogpile it or anything, but all it is a blue splash screen with people talking over it. That's the movie. And because we're in a visual space, a blue splash screen may have an effect on you. And so that may go into that general effect category. Like it was very effective to have this blue screen. It made me think about Derek's impending death from AIDS or something. That might have an effect on you, but it's not an aesthetic. It's a lack of aesthetic. So it would be a 1, right? Maybe a 1.5 because you did a color instead of black. I don't know. 1.1. It's lack of any visual appeal whatsoever. Remember, you're in a film space. If you didn't care about the visuals, you could have released this as an audio CD. Why not? If it's only about the audio that's on it, then you don't really need to have it as a film, right? We wouldn't go to see the newest Metallica movie and watch a black screen while we listen to music. That's called just listening to music. You put the CD into your stereo and you listen to the music. So that would be like a 1 on the visual appeal scale. Things that might be even higher than that, but lower. There's another movie I'll talk about in a minute called Blue Movie. It was another movie called Blue, but it's called Blue Movie, and it's by Andy Warhol, and it's just 2 people talking in an apartment. There's really no visual design there. It's incredibly boring. There's nothing to it. There's nothing of interest. It's 2 people talking on a bed and having like pornographic relations with each other. That's like a 2 or a 3. There's really nothing to it. So when you see that there's a really, really low scores that can happen, you can understand that some things can be 5s or 6s, and that's a good score for them, and other things can be 8, 9, 10. You can follow through with everything. Like music, if the music is just annoying sounds, that's going to be like a 1 or a 2. If there's no music, that really becomes an artistic choice, and so you would just leave that category out of everything. Likewise, if you're watching a romantic comedy, effects and cinematography, you may not just want to give that a score because they don't affect the story. It's mostly just putting the camera up and having people say funny lines to each other. So why would you give that a score? It shouldn't really negatively impact it too much. Romantic comedies are a hard one for this. I don't do a lot of evaluations of them though. So this is really well suited to things that make full use of the medium of film or of games. For games, I would actually have another big category called gameplay. Anyway, moving into story. So there's 3 things I usually talk about with story: setting, characters, and plot. Sometimes I leave setting out because it's just not relevant. If it takes place in contemporary New York, we don't really need to talk about how they expose the setting. Settings mostly for science fiction and fantasy types of movies where the setting really needs exposition. It's a thing interesting in and of itself. The characters are how well those characters not only are written, but how they're acted. So that's where the acting score ends up being factored in, is in the character. So if the dialogue is well written, but it's terribly acted, that's going to be low on the character score. If the character is acting really bad dialogue well, it's still going to maybe be a lower score because it's not very good dialogue. So that's the character score. And then finally, you do have the plot score. That's going to be the event sequence. So does the story make sense? And so sometimes it could just be 2, characters and plot. Both of those are equally important to make the movie work well. But in a big science fiction movie, it's not the total story. You could get a low story score and have a really good visual score and possibly get to a 6, depending on how that general effect is. So that's the last one, how things make me feel. To me, to get down to the 1 or 2 range, it's something which has to be just incredibly annoying. Something that just annoyed me beginning to end. There's a movie that I watched really out of morbid curiosity called Chaos. And I watched it because it had a 0-star review from Roger Ebert, who said he wouldn't wish it on his worst enemies. And it truly was annoying. It was one of the most annoying movies I've ever seen in my life. Another one would probably be like Freddy Got Fingered. Freddy Got Fingered would be like a 3. Chaos would be like a 2 or a 1. It's actively difficult to watch it because, not because it's like too horrific or too bloody, but that it could be that. But it was really just, you're hearing women pretend to scream for 2 hours. It's really annoying. So that would be down in the 2 or 1 category, where something that makes me simply bored would be like 4 or 5. If it's bored to the point where I can't stand to watch it and I have to like pull out my phone or like turn it off and read a book, that's going to be a really low score as well. Whereas a very high score would be something that really has an effect on you, something that really makes you feel good or makes you feel really bad, something that has a real kicker ending. Something like The Sixth Sense would be a 9 or a 10 out of 10 because of that great ending that just was so effective. Something like like a classic Francis Ford Coppola movie like The Godfather might be a 9 or a 10 in general effect because of how it makes you feel at the end of the movie. Things like that. So those things, or like The Shawshank Redemption, I think is a great general effect movie. So all of those high quality movies are going to have a high general effect. But you could have a movie with a middling general effect, but you still really appreciate the visuals. That's going to be reflected in the score. So that's how I break it down. That's where all those averages come from. And the reason I average those big categories together is to make it a little bit more objective and kind of move my feelings into a properly weighted part of the score and really look at things from a logical and valuation-based perspective, as if I'm like grading a film project at school. The last thing I'll say is about comparisons. I try to make films so that the comparisons are valid based on how it's presented. So TV shows, I think, should be compared to TV shows. And I think movies should be compared to other movies. But at the same time, there's different kinds of movies. There's Netflix, made-for-Netflix movies. There's low-budget movies. And then there's big blockbusters. And so it's important whenever I'm making a comparison, I really want to say, hey, I want to compare this to other blockbusters. It's not fair to compare an episode of Star Trek to a blockbuster movie. It's just not fair because you're looking at $200 million concentrated into 2 hours versus, I don't know how much it costs to make an episode of Star Trek, but that much money concentrated into 30 or 40 minutes to come up with the same idea. If you want to go back to score, I'll say this with story because I just forgot to mention it. Blue Movie is an example of a plot of 0 or 1. There's no plot. It's just people talking. So because there's no plot and there's nothing written, it's a art film by Andy Warhol, it'd be a 1. So if I were to just apply this score to Blue Movie as an example, aesthetics, I'd probably give the aesthetics of a 2. It not only aesthetically is boring, it just doesn't really look good either. It's 2 unattractive people having pornographic relations on screen. And I've seen this movie, so don't make me watch it again. And you could watch it at your own peril. It might be an interesting experience for you. Who knows? Cinematography and effects, I'd give a 2. They actually called this the Blue Movie because they didn't understand what film to use. So like halfway through the movie, all the film grading changes. It's fuzzy and it looks like garbage. It really does look bad. So 2, And then sound design, you can barely hear them. And there's no music. So why don't we say music and sound design? We'll just make a new category. This is what's great about this system is you can adapt it. You talk about whatever's relevant in that category. So sound 4, 5. We make the sound of 5. You can kind of hear what people are talking about, but a lot of times they're mumbling, talking into a pillow. There's no attempt to correct it. So you end up with like a production score where it's like, what, 2 plus 3 plus 5? What's the average of whatever the average of that is, like 3.3, 3.5 or something. Now, that's really low. That's an F. So you're looking at like visually in production, it's an F. So Andy Warhol made an F movie as far as how he produced it. You want a story. There's no setting. That probably wouldn't be relevant because it's just people talking. So we just won't include that. Characters. It's 2 people that you don't know anything about, and you don't know anything about them at the end of the movie. So 3? I don't know. And then plot. There's no plot. 1. So we got a score of 2. for story. And then general effect, it was so boring that I didn't want to sit through it. And even when they got to like pornographic sex, that wasn't interesting to watch either. So it wasn't good on any level. 3. So you're like, oh, this movie is a 3 or a 2. It's really bad. It's really hard to get a score lower than 2 or 3, and that's just a really good application of what a bad movie actually looks like. To get down to that 2 or 3 range, you have to have not just extreme failure, but failure across the board, and not even including things which are necessary for a film to exist, like a plot. If there's no plot, if it's just a collection of scenes, then you're in trouble. And I'm aware I really like Monty Python, but that's a story for another day. So thanks so much for watching. Leave me your thoughts down below, how you like to evaluate movies, and I'll see you guys next time. Newest books. I don't even have my newest books handy, but here's 2 that I think are good. Both of these are 99 cents on Amazon. This one's very popular, Voices of the Void. This is sci-fi horror is what I would call this. This one is high fantasy, but it's a 2-hour read. It's quite slim. Very interesting experimental book. Hopefully you guys will like that, and I'll see you guys next time.